I never thought I'd be the one to consider stepping outside the bounds of my own ethical code. Yet here I was, a mug of herbal tea turning cold in my anxious hands, replaying a conversation I'd had earlier this afternoon with my husband, Mathew. In that conversation, a wave of tension had rippled through the living room between us the moment I said, "Mathew, we need to talk." His eyes, tinged with confusion and a hint of dread, were enough to make my heart pound. Deep down, my mind was racing, reeling from weeks of pent-up worries. We both knew that conversation could change everything. Neither of us was prepared for what I might propose, and I was still battling my own conscience. For the past few months, our marriage had felt as if it were teetering on a thin wire. Both of us were feeling too tired at the end of each day to share more than 3 or 4 words before dozing off. Our honeymoon period had ended so quietly that we barely noticed until the distance between us had become undeniable. I'd asked myself countless times, where had our laughter gone? Where was the closeness that used to make me feel safe? The routine had grown stifling, the nights painfully silent. Occasionally I'd watch Mathew sit at the table, shoulders hunched, poring over client spreadsheets and think, does he still feel the same bond I do, or are we just two strangers under one roof? The spark that once kept us connected seemed to have vanished. Night after night I would come home from the restaurant, slipping off my apron after double shifts, only to find him in bed, lights out, asleep before I could even say goodnight. We were both desperate to hold it together, but neither of us knew how. I felt captivity in the monotony of work, bills, and chores. Mathew felt trapped by his own obligations, too. When exhaustion takes over, it's easy for doubts to creep in. I began to wonder if I was a cheating wife in the making, caught up in real infidelity stories playing out in my own head, or if we were simply so busy with day-to-day drudgery that we'd lost all sense of adventure. That sense of unease grew stronger after my best friend Natalia came over in tears one evening, lamenting about her own missteps in an open marriage scenario. As she spoke, she was shaking with regret, recounting how such an arrangement almost destroyed her marriage. She'd been dating other men to spice things up, she said, but the consequences were more severe than she had imagined. In that moment, something in me cracked open like a window to a new dimension. I wasn't sure I wanted an open marriage ourselves. Just the phrase alone sent a thrill of terror right through my ribs. But I won't lie. My mind was racing as soon as the concept lodged itself in my head. Perhaps, I told myself, anything that might help us rekindle the romance between us again was worth considering. But that thought was also the start of me battling my own conscience at a deeper level. Natalia's story was complicated. It reminded me of real infidelity stories I'd heard before. She explained how her husband eventually found evidence of an untraceable bank account she had been using to fund secret dinners and trips. When confronted, she couldn't deny the truth. Her request almost destroyed marriage bonds they'd built for years. She had become, in her own words, a cheating wife who made a terrible decision, and it had led to heartbreak. Still, she admitted there was an odd thrill in dating other men. That left me with a mixture of curiosity and dread. My own conscience wouldn't let me rest, because I knew thinking about other people that way was dangerous. I was tempted to consider infidelity even as I loathed the very idea. The conflict was so intense that for several nights I laid awake in bed, tempted to consider infidelity even as I loathed the very idea, picturing both the horrifying scenario of losing Mathew and the twisted excitement of something new. It was as though I had one chance to stop me now before stepping off a ledge from which I couldn't return. Finally, I broke down. I told Mathew how I felt, about our stagnation, about my fear that we could slip in to become a cautionary tale of two people who simply gave up. I knew, and I could see it in his eyes, that he felt powerless. We both did. It was during one of those hushed talks in our living room that the words slipped from me. Maybe we need something unconventional, like dating other men or women. Maybe we need that excitement. His reaction was as immediate as it was painful. I saw his face pale. "Mariah," he said, voice trembling, "please tell me you're not serious." I realized in that moment my suggestion might lead us straight to a final state talk, the sort of brutal, concluding conversation couples have right before everything ends. I stumbled to explain. I'm not saying I want to run out and engage in sexual activity with strangers, but we're stuck. I just don't want us to regress to the point where we barely know each other. I worry about our shared future together if we continue like this. Mathew's expression was stricken. He stood up from the couch and began pacing the length of our small living room as I studied his every movement. By suggesting an open marriage, you're basically telling me that I'm not enough for you, that you might become a cheating wife if things don't improve. He let out a pained, hollow laugh. I can't survive that, Mariah. If we risk that, it might destroy everything. Her request almost destroyed marriage vows for Natalia, and I don't want us walking down the same path. Hearing those words chilled me. I could practically feel the foundation of our relationship quivering beneath my feet. It struck me how easily one rash decision, one leap into the unknown, could demolish the life we'd built. I thought about real infidelity stories I'd read, and still, the idea wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to control the direction of the conversation, but it was too late. The topic of an open marriage had already taken center stage, and each of us was too shocked to pivot gracefully. It didn't end there. That night, we went to bed without speaking. We were still feeling too tired to continue the argument, yet neither of us got a moment of restful sleep. I lay there, eyes burning. My mind was racing with scenarios of heartbreak and possibility alike. On one hand, I recognized that giving in to the exciting temptation of freedom might cause irreparable harm. On the other hand, part of me was screaming that the only way to rekindle the romance between us again might be to do something radical. I wanted to reignite the passion we once shared when we were newlyweds. We had laughter, playful banter, spontaneous intimacy, none of which we'd experienced for too long. I didn't want to be the person who let our marriage slip away because of complacency. A few days later, I met Natalia for coffee, desperate for a clearer perspective. She was somber, stirring her cappuccino with a trembling hand. I nearly destroyed her marriage, my marriage actually, by chasing a thrill, she admitted. I can't tell you what to do, Mariah, but if it's between risking your entire relationship to feel alive or doing the work to reconnect with your husband, I'd choose the latter. Look at me. I was a cheating wife, made a terrible decision. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone. I sighed heavily, my entire chest tightening with guilt. But was there nothing positive in it? Did it help at all? Natalia shook her head. At first, it felt amazing. I believed a little fling would help me pursue something brand new together with my husband, make us see each other differently. Instead, it turned out that I was just doubling down on lust with other men. The secrecy, the lies, it was exhilarating, but also terrifying. Eventually, I realized I was on a path to break the bond with the one person I loved most. If you're even at this crossroads, think carefully. Seeing each other as a burden is the real enemy, not the lack of new experiences. Her words echoed in me for days. I found Mathew and me drifting around each other like strangers, both of us weighed down by the unspoken fear of discovering the truth in our own hearts. That maybe we had already done too much damage, or maybe we were too complacent to fix things. We avoided each other's eyes at dinner, picking silently at our plates. If one of us tried to speak, the other would shut down. It was as if we were each waiting for a final state talk that would wrap up our marriage for good, and that terrified me, because more than anything, I still loved him. Yet I also knew the suggestion I'd made. Her request almost destroyed our marriage, those words practically shining like a neon sign in my brain, now hung over us. Even if we never acted on it, the memory of me being tempted to consider infidelity wouldn't vanish. I was battling my own conscience every moment of the day. Did I want the label of cheating wife attached to me forever? Could we still find a way back to each other, or had I broken his trust beyond repair? Even if we never took it further, the seeds of doubt were already planted. A week wandered by in that frigid silence. Finally, I found a note on the coffee table when I came home from work. It was from Mathew, scrawled in his neat, angular handwriting. Mariah, I'm sorry for the tension. I see how unhappy we both are, and I know I haven't done enough to change that. Let's talk. For real, this time. Meet me at the Adobe Cafe near the marina at 7 p.m. My heart hammered. Relief and dread mingled. This could be it, I thought. The conversation that either saves us or ends us. Through my entire shift the next day at the restaurant, I couldn't concentrate. What if I said the wrong thing? What if my suggestion of an open marriage hammered a wedge impossible to remove? I had one chance to stop me now, I kept thinking. One chance to make sure I didn't push us off the edge onto a path from which there'd be no return. I arrived at the cafe shrouded in early evening light, my hair still damp from a hurried shower. The place was sleepy and unassuming, the whiff of coffee hanging in the air. Mathew was sitting at a small table near the window, sipping water and looking drawn. When he saw me, he waved me over but didn't smile. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, silently begging for calm. For a moment, we could only look at each other, all the words we needed to say stacked up in our throats. "So," Mathew started, clearing his throat, "I can't stop thinking about what you said, about dating other men, about how you're feeling trapped and numb. I hate that you feel that way." His voice quivered. "I've been thinking that maybe we can find a different path, something that won't risk you becoming a cheating wife, or me stumbling down a path of bitterness in response." I bit my lip, preventing tears. I was wrong to suggest something I knew would hurt you. My own conscience wouldn't let me sleep. The moment I blurted it out, I regretted it. But I was so desperate. I was scared this numbness was unstoppable. I thought maybe a radical move would fix it. Mathew twisted the napkin in his hands. "I love you, Mariah, and I want to reignite the passion, but if we can't do it together, if we can't find a way to rekindle our romance without looking outside, then maybe we've already lost. I don't want to watch us ruin everything we've built, our shared future together." I saw it flash before my eyes. The children we once talked about having, the dream of traveling to Europe some summer, the little traditions we'd nurtured at Christmas. All of those hopes flickered like a feeble candle in a drafty hall. "Then let's do it," I said in a breathy whisper. "Let's risk actual adventure, but with each other. Let's take classes, try new things, talk openly about what we want, even if it's embarrassing. I want to rekindle the romance between us again, but do it responsibly." He sighed with relief, though worry still skated across his expression. "I'm on board, but I need a promise from you. No more talk about an open marriage, no more illusions that dating other men is some magic ticket. We have to confront our slump head-on." Tears welled in my eyes, and I squeezed his hand in mine. "I promise," I whispered. "No more crazy proposals. I see now that her request almost destroyed our marriage. I never wanted that. I'm sorry." For the first time in weeks, we spent the evening discussing everything openly with each other. We talked about frustrations at work, how we both dreaded waking up feeling too tired to connect, and how our hopes got lost in the shuffle of daily routines. We decided that every weekend we'd carve out time for just ourselves. No phones, no laptops, just us, focusing on what we used to love about each other. We would give ourselves permission to be vulnerable again. That evening, I went home not with gloom, but with a new sense of purpose. My mind was racing in a different way now, swirling with possibilities. Could we truly do it? Pursue something brand new together that would reignite our spark? If so, this might be the turning point we'd both silently prayed for. I felt a glimmer of confidence returning as we lay side by side in bed. We didn't engage in sexual activity that night. Instead, we simply held hands, whispering about random memories from our early days of dating. It felt intimate, tender. I realized that depth might be what we truly needed. Still, the next morning brought lingering questions. Over breakfast, Mathew confessed that the concept of me seeing other men, even in conversation, still rattled him. "I keep thinking about Natalia's words about her untraceable bank account and how she used it to fund secret liaisons," he said, a dark line etched across his brow. "I never want to have to rummage through receipts or phone bills, worried about you stepping out." There was a tremble in his voice that put a lump in my throat. I can't handle the fear of discovering the truth like that. If we ever come to that point, it means we're not being honest, and we've failed." "I understand," I replied gently. "I never want to be in Natalia's shoes. Cheating wife made a terrible decision. She'll be the first to admit it. I'm not going to let that be my story. I'm choosing you, Mathew." In that moment, I could see how fragile trust can be. Even exploring the idea of open marriage had left a scar, but we were determined to heal, and possibly to grow stronger than before. We spent the weekend writing a list of activities we'd never tried: tango lessons at the local community center, volunteering together at an animal rescue, a road trip to see mountain hot springs. Each idea seemed to reignite new hope. We joked that maybe the real adventure was simply learning how to carve out space for each other in our busy schedules. That first weekend, we decided on tango lessons. It was impulsive enough that neither of us had time to get cold feet. I wore a simple black dress, and Mathew wore loafers that made him look surprisingly dapper. The lesson was awkward and hilarious. Our feet tangled more than once, but we laughed. At one point, the instructor teased us for acting like shy teenagers, but as Mathew pressed his palm against my back, I found a renewed sense of closeness washing over me. We were stepping out of our comfort zones together. I realized how rarely we had done that in the past year. From then on, each small victory felt like a triumph. We practiced tango spins in our kitchen, giggling when we accidentally bumped into the dining table. We grew less worried about the overshadowing memory of that conversation about dating other men. Both of us remained mindful that we'd come precariously close to fracturing our bond. And yet, the more time we spent focusing on each other, the more I felt the tug of genuine excitement. I was giving in to the exciting temptation of loving my husband anew, discovering new facets, new laughter. We'd promised to keep discussing everything openly with each other, no matter how difficult. Communication, ironically, was the one thing we'd both neglected in our desperate attempts to maintain our hectic work lives. While we were making progress, some awkwardness lingered. One evening, as we tidied up the house, Mathew sheepishly asked, "Do you still think about that idea, that maybe we should see other people?" He tried to say it casually, but I could sense the tension in the question. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "The thought doesn't excite me anymore. It just scares me now," I told him honestly. When I mentioned an open marriage, it was out of fear we'd never get our spark back. I felt so hopeless. Now, though, I don't want to lose you. I want to reignite the passion with you, not with anyone else." That answer seemed to soothe him. He nodded, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Good, because I never doubted I loved you, but I doubted whether we had enough fight left to rekindle our romance. I'm so grateful we didn't just throw in the towel." We kissed then, softly, like a promise, and just like that, something inside me flickered, as if a candle relit in a once dark room. A few weeks passed, and we continued our New Experiences project. We volunteered at a local dog shelter for an entire afternoon, giving the dogs walks and baths side by side. At one point, drenched from a vigorously shaking golden retriever, I caught Mathew's eye and we both burst out laughing. The laughter felt pure, unforced. In that moment, it was evident. We could still find joy together. We just had to pursue something brand new together whenever we risked falling back into monotony. Of course, the specter of my earlier proposal, that her request almost destroyed marriage bonds we thought unbreakable, still hovered now and then. Natalia would call to check in, to see if we were okay. She still struggled in her own life, working hard to repair the trust she had broken with her husband. Her journey was a cautionary tale for me, reinforcing that engaging in sexual activity outside our marriage was a risk I didn't want to take. I'd already come too close to stepping into that abyss. It wasn't worth the twisted thrill to become a cheating wife. Made a terrible decision. That phrase recurred in my head like a warning siren. Sometimes we only realize how precious something is when we nearly lose it. On a balmy Friday night after finishing work earlier than usual, Mathew surprised me with a candle-lit dinner at home. The table was set with 2 tall tapers, a modest bouquet of daisies, my favorite, and a bottle of wine. He had ordered takeout from the restaurant where I worked, but the gesture was what mattered. We sat together, letting the rest of the world go quiet, and we began discussing everything openly with each other once again. From small talk about how adulting had begun to overshadow spontaneity to deeper confessions of how close each of us had come to losing hope in our marriage. At first, it felt awkward, like peeling away thick layers of armor, but gradually, the soft glow of the candlelight and the familiarity of our shared home made it easier to bare our souls. I admitted how insecure I'd felt, worried that maybe he was too tired of me to fight for us. He shared how trapped and helpless he had become, not knowing how to restore what we had lost. Neither of us raised our voices. Instead, each word felt like a thread, stitching up tears in the fragile fabric that bound us. By the time we'd finished the meal, our hearts were lighter. Mathew reached across the table, lacing his fingers through mine. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for all the times I withdrew and left you alone, feeling unloved. Work was an excuse, but it doesn't justify letting our connection wither." I squeezed his hand, tears threatening to spill over. "I'm sorry too, for even thinking an open marriage was worth considering. I was afraid we'd stagnate forever, but I should have trusted we could find our way back to each other." He stood up, motioning for me to follow him into the living room, where he drew me into a slow, gentle dance. No music played at first, just the hum of the city street outside. It was more swaying than dancing, but the warmth between us was real. We smiled into each other's eyes, and the hush in the room felt charged with new possibility. Eventually, Mathew turned on a streaming playlist, soft jazz, and we continued moving in tandem. As the mellow horns filled the space, we talked about next steps. We agreed to keep honoring our promises, date nights every week, trying something novel each month, whether it was sampling a new cuisine, taking another dance class, or surprising each other with little acts of tenderness. We resolved to share every fear and desire, even the uncomfortable ones, rather than letting them fester in silence. And above all, never again would we give each other reason to doubt our loyalty. In that candlelit haven, I realized how near we had come to letting the best parts of ourselves slip away under the weight of responsibilities and routines. We could have shattered our vows if we'd turned to outsiders instead of forging a deeper bond with one another. Yet here we were, recommitting to risk actual adventure together rather than ache separately. Standing in his arms, I felt the same flutter in my chest I'd felt the day we said, "I do." Much later that night, we lingered by the dying candles, finishing the last sip of wine. Mathew cradled my face in his hands and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. "We made it through a dark time," he said quietly, "and maybe it'll get dark again. But I want you to know I'm here, Mariah, and I'm fighting for us." I gazed back at him, heart full. "I'm here too," I whispered, "because I believe we can create something new out of the love we already have. After all we've been through, I'm even more certain I can't lose you." We extinguished the candles and headed to bed. This time, as we curled up under the covers, the silence was comfortable, no longer weighed down by anxiety and unspoken tension. A gentle peace enveloped us, and though no grand words were uttered, it felt like the beginning of a brand new chapter, one where the two of us would keep choosing each other day after day, rediscovering that the spark we thought was lost just needed time, effort, and love to glow anew.